In the bustling corridors of JFK International Airport, a scene unfolded that would soon ignite a nationwide conversation about racial discrimination and corporate accountability. Dr. Isla Monroe, a distinguished black CEO of a leading tech firm, boarded her flight, anticipating a routine journey. Holding a first-class ticket, she settled into her assigned VIP seat, ready to unwind after a series of high-stakes meetings. Moments later, a flight attendant approached Dr. Monroe with a request that defied logic and decency. She was asked to relinquish her seat for another passenger, a white individual who, according to the attendant, had special circumstances. Dr. Monroe, taken aback, inquired about the nature of these circumstances, only to receive vague and unsatisfactory explanations. Despite presenting her boarding pass and asserting her rightful claim to the seat, Dr. Monroe was met with insistence and, eventually, an ultimatum. Faced with the prospect of escalating the situation, she chose to comply, moving to a different seat while grappling with feelings of humiliation and disbelief. Unbeknownst to the flight crew, Dr. Monroe's influence extended far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Within minutes, she contacted her legal team and corporate partners, detailing the incident and expressing her intent to address the injustice. The response was swift and resolute. By the time the plane landed, the airline's upper management had been alerted, an internal investigation was launched, and the crew members involved were suspended pending review. Public relations teams scrambled to manage the fallout as news of the incident spread across social media platforms, garnering widespread attention and outrage. The airline issued a formal apology to Dr. Monroe, acknowledging the mishandling of the situation and pledging to implement comprehensive training programs aimed at preventing such occurrences in the future. However, the damage had been done, and the public demanded accountability. In a decisive move, the airline terminated the employment of the staff members directly involved in the incident. This action, while significant, sparked debates about systemic issues within the industry and the measures necessary to ensure equitable treatment for all passengers. Dr. Monroe's experience served as a catalyst for broader discussions about racial bias, privilege, and the responsibilities of corporations in addressing discrimination. Her decision to speak out not only highlighted the challenges faced by black professionals, but also underscored the power of individual agency in affecting change. In the corporate boardrooms where optics are everything, the fallout from the incident was nothing short of an earthquake. Dr. Isla Monroe wasn't just any passenger. She was the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company that had strategic partnerships with major airlines, including the one she had just flown with. Within hours, the story had gone viral, not just because a black woman had been asked to give up her rightful seat, but because it exposed a deep, rotting corporate culture when it comes to race, power, and perception. The flight staff that forced Dr. Monroe to move had no idea who she was. To them, she was just another black woman they could push aside without consequence. But Dr. Monroe's background wasn't just decorated with accolades. It was forged through decades of navigating systemic racism in business, in tech, and now in the skies. Her company's legal team drafted a response that was clinical, brutal, and unrelenting. A lawsuit was announced, one that named not only the airline but specific employees, citing racial discrimination, emotional distress, and breach of contract. At the same time, powerful allies from the business world rallied behind Dr. Monroe. CEOs from Fortune 500 companies posted statements. Influencers lit up Twitter. Civil rights attorneys called it textbook racial profiling. The airline's board of directors scrambled. The incident became a crisis not just of public relations but of investor confidence. Stock prices dipped. Shareholders demanded action. By day 2, the airline CEO was on national television apologizing. But words weren't enough. Actions had to follow. Within 72 hours of the incident, the entire flight crew involved in the altercation had their employment terminated. The head of in-flight operations resigned. HR leadership was replaced. And the airline pledged $20 million toward racial bias training and equity initiatives. But to many in the public, that wasn't penance. It was PR. For Dr. Monroe, the issue was never about personal vengeance. It was about systemic accountability. She publicly stated in an interview, "If this can happen to someone like me, imagine what happens daily to those without my platform. This isn't just my fight. It's a fight for everyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or erased. What followed next was unprecedented. Federal regulators announced they were opening an investigation into the airline's practices. Former employees began coming forward with stories of similar incidents, some worse. Racial discrimination lawsuits began piling up. What had started with one woman being displaced in a first-class seat had become a national reckoning. Dr. Monroe's legal team didn't stop at the airline. They filed a class-action lawsuit to invite other victims of similar discrimination to come forward. Over 120 people responded within the first week. The story hit international headlines. Major news outlets ran specials. Talk shows debated the racial dynamics of air travel. In court, the legal strategy was clear: expose a pattern. Emails, memos, and training documents were subpoenaed. What they found shocked even seasoned civil rights attorneys. Internal documents showed the airline had settled multiple complaints of racial profiling in the past 10 years, none of which had been made public. Worse, there were internal jokes, inappropriate memos, and evidence that minority passengers were disproportionately flagged for security concerns. Public pressure intensified. The FAA issued statements. Congressional hearings were discussed. The NAACP issued travel advisories. And all the while, Dr. Monroe remained measured, focused, and relentless. Behind closed doors, the airline's legal counsel began pushing for a settlement. But Dr. Monroe refused silence money. She wanted a full apology, policy overhaul, and for the company to issue a public acknowledgement of the discrimination. When the case reached court, the proceedings were electric. Civil rights icons attended. Media swarmed the courthouse. In her testimony, Dr. Monroe described the moment she was told to give up her seat. She spoke not just of the humiliation, but the deeper, centuries-long wound it touched, the idea that black people are always expected to yield. The airline's lawyers tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, but video footage from passengers, now viral, showed the truth. The tone, the expressions, the clear racial undertone. The jury deliberated for only 7 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts of racial discrimination, emotional distress, and civil rights violation. The airline was ordered to pay $45 million in damages, and a public statement had to be aired on all their flights for 90 days, acknowledging the incident and outlining their new anti-discrimination policies. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Supporters of Dr. Monroe wept. Others applauded. The weight of centuries of injustice had briefly lifted, if only slightly. But for the airline, the damage was only beginning. The $45 million penalty wasn't just about financial loss. It was about legacy, brand trust, and irreversible public judgment. In the days that followed, news outlets ran back-to-back coverage of the case. Opinion pieces flooded every major publication. The words systemic racism and corporate accountability were back in the center of national discourse. Civil rights leaders called it a pivotal moment in modern legal history. And for black business leaders across the country, Dr. Monroe became a symbol of unshakable resolve. The airline tried to rebrand. They replaced their top leadership. They issued a tearful video apology from a newly installed CEO. They changed their tagline. None of it mattered. Public trust was broken. Passenger bookings dropped 23% in the following month. Investor confidence plummeted. Several partner corporations pulled out of joint campaigns and collaborative deals. In less than 60 days, a powerhouse in the airline industry had gone from dominant to disgraced. But Dr. Monroe's mission wasn't over. She launched a national initiative, Equal Skies, a nonprofit designed to fight racial discrimination in travel. It offered legal resources, advocacy tools, and direct support for victims of bias on airlines, trains, and public transportation. Donations poured in. The organization was featured in national magazines. By year's end, Equal Skies had funded over 30 lawsuits on behalf of mistreated travelers, some involving wrongful detainment, seat reassignments, and even airport profiling. One of those lawsuits involved a 19-year-old college student who was asked to step off a flight in Salt Lake City because another passenger felt uncomfortable sitting next to him. The student was black. He had done nothing but sit quietly. Within 3 months, with support from equal skies, the case was in federal court. The media pressure mounted again. Airlines were being watched like never before. This ripple effect led to national legislative attention. Senators began drafting proposals for the Airline Passenger Protection Act, new federal standards for how passengers could be treated, how complaints would be investigated, and penalties for discriminatory practices. What began as a single injustice had grown into a full-fledged civil rights wave aimed at reshaping the American air travel experience. Dr. Monroe testified before Congress. Cameras captured every word. She said, "Travel should never be a luxury for dignity. No one, regardless of race, gender, or class, should ever be made to feel less than human for simply boarding a plane. This is our moment to choose progress or pretend. We pretended long enough." As the legislative gears turned, the cultural tide had already shifted. Talk shows, podcasts, documentaries. Everyone was talking about the flight that exposed the nation's wounds. Late-night hosts analyzed it. Professors assigned it. High school students wrote essays about it. For many, the incident became shorthand for something deeper. It wasn't just about Dr. Monroe. It was about every moment a black person had to weigh whether speaking up meant survival or punishment. It was about how often misunderstandings turned into trauma, about how often silence had been the only safe option. But Dr. Monroe hadn't been silent, and that fact alone shattered decades of dangerous precedent. The airline industry responded by implementing real-time complaint monitoring systems. Flight crews were retrained. Racial sensitivity programs became mandatory, with penalties for noncompliance. Other industries followed. Ride-share companies updated their discrimination protocols. Hotel chains reviewed their guest removal policies. Transportation boards across the U.S. quietly began rewriting how they train staff. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe's personal brand soared. She was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. She gave the keynote speech at Harvard Law. She published a best-selling memoir, Seat Taken, The Cost of Standing Up. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a manifesto, a call to action, and people were listening. But even in the face of praise and power, she stayed grounded. She returned to her company. Her board of directors gave her a standing ovation. Her staff, many of whom had felt the sting of racial inequity in the corporate world, now had a leader who didn't just represent them. She fought for them. And still, her message never wavered. "I didn't ask for the spotlight. I didn't want to make headlines. But if my silence had allowed this to happen again to someone else, then I would have betrayed every black woman who came before me. I owed them more. We all do." As the legislative gears turned, the cultural tide had already shifted. Talk shows, podcasts, documentaries. Everyone was talking about the flight that exposed the nation's wounds. Late-night hosts analyzed it. Professors assigned it. High school students wrote essays about it. For many, the incident became shorthand for something deeper. It wasn't just about Dr. Monroe. It was about every moment a black person had to weigh whether speaking up meant survival or punishment. It was about how often misunderstandings turned into trauma, about how often silence had been the only safe option. But Dr. Monroe hadn't been silent, and that fact alone shattered decades of dangerous precedent. The airline industry responded by implementing real-time complaint monitoring systems. Flight crews were retrained. Racial sensitivity programs became mandatory, with penalties for noncompliance. Other industries followed. Ride-share companies updated their discrimination protocols. Hotel chains reviewed their guest removal policies. Transportation boards across the U.S. quietly began rewriting how they train staff. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe's personal brand soared. She was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. She gave the keynote speech at Harvard Law. She published a best-selling memoir, Seat Taken, The Cost of Standing Up. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a manifesto, a call to action, and people were listening. But even in the face of praise and power, she stayed grounded. She returned to her company. Her board of directors gave her a standing ovation. Her staff, many of whom had felt the sting of racial inequity in the corporate world, now had a leader who didn't just represent them. She fought for them. And still, her message never wavered. I didn't ask for the spotlight. I didn't want to make headlines. But if my silence had allowed this to happen again to someone else, then I would have betrayed every black woman who came before me. I owed them more. We all do, behind the headlines. There were real people whose lives were affected by the ripple of this one event. A flight attendant in Dallas, who had been racially profiled by her own employer, came forward after 5 years of silence. A retired pilot revealed that he had been sidelined for promotions due to his ethnicity. An elderly black woman from Baltimore shared how she'd once been forced to gate-check her carry-on, while a white couple next to her was allowed aboard with 2 extra bags. Stories poured in, old wounds reopened. But this time, they were finally being believed. Dr. Monroe began hosting forums, safe spaces where people could come forward, share, and heal. It wasn't therapy, but it was justice in another form. Truth, spoken publicly, unafraid. One of the most emotional moments came when a young boy, just 11 years old, stood up at a community town hall. He told Dr. Monroe, through tears, that he had been forced to sit at the back of a school bus during a field trip because there weren't enough seats in the front. His classmates, who didn't look like him, sat comfortably ahead. The teacher told him it was just how it worked out. He said, "When I saw you on TV, I thought, if she can say something, maybe I can too." Dr. Monroe hugged him. Cameras captured it. The image went viral. But more than that, it became a symbol, not a victory, but a visibility. A reminder that dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you're owed. Nearly a year after the incident, the world had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The airline that once humiliated Dr. Monroe had restructured entirely. Their board now had new members from diverse backgrounds. Passenger complaint response times were down to under 24 hours. Their diversity metrics were public and audited quarterly. Flight crews were trained using real scenarios based on true discrimination cases. But Dr. Monroe's focus had shifted from reaction to prevention. She began pushing legislation that would embed anti-discrimination policies into federal transportation law, not just guidelines laws, enforceable, prosecutable, standardized protections. And she had support. Bipartisan lawmakers co-sponsored the Equal Skies Act, introduced in both chambers of Congress. It proposed sweeping changes. A federal database of airline discrimination complaints. Independent civilian oversight boards for major carriers. Mandatory diversity representation on all corporate travel boards. Federal penalties for companies that failed to address repeated incidents. The bill wasn't just a policy shift. It was a paradigm shift. While lobbyists pushed back, public opinion was undeniable. Petitions with over 5 million signatures demanded passage. Celebrities, scholars, students, even religious leaders publicly endorsed the legislation. By the time the vote arrived, it passed with a majority in both houses. The president signed it into law on live television. Dr. Monroe didn't stand at the podium that day. She sat in the crowd, quiet, still, watching the system she once had to fight finally move toward justice on its own. 1 year after the incident that shook the aviation industry and forced the country to confront its reflection, a plaque was installed at the entrance of Atlanta's busiest airport. It bore the following words: "In honor of every traveler who dared to speak when silence was expected, this is not just about seats. This is about standing ground. Equality has no altitude." Beneath it, Dr. Isla Monroe, CEO, advocate, survivor. Thousands pass that plaque daily. Business travelers, vacationers, students on field trips. Some stopped. Some took pictures. Others walked by. But its presence was a permanent scar etched into the foundation of a system that had, for too long, operated without accountability. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe kept building. Not for attention. Not for headlines. But because justice was never supposed to be episodic. It had to be institutional. Her nonprofit, Equal Skies, opened offices in 8 major cities. Each was staffed by civil rights attorneys, aviation compliance specialists, and mental health counselors. They didn't just handle lawsuits. They offered healing. They launched FlyFair, a national database allowing travelers to report discrimination incidents in real time. Within the first 3 months, Over 18,000 submissions were recorded. The numbers were staggering, and they proved what black passengers had always known. That discrimination wasn't the exception. It was the quiet, recurring rule. Dr. Monroe took those numbers to courtrooms, to corporate meetings, to Senate subcommittees. Her data became undeniable, her voice inescapable, her leadership unshakable. Somewhere between boarding passes and baggage claims, between TSA checkpoints and gate announcements, a movement had been born. And what made it powerful wasn't just its legal victories or viral moments, but its humanity. This story, this moment, was never just about one woman in a luxury seat. It was about the thousands of others who had sat in silence for decades, too afraid to lose a job, a flight, or even their life by simply objecting to mistreatment. Airline companies began partnering with HBCUs to build pipelines for future black pilots. Airports adopted murals of black aviation pioneers. School curriculums began teaching the story of Dr. Monroe alongside Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and Bessie Coleman. And still, despite all the progress, Dr. Monroe warned the world, change is not guaranteed. It's guarded. And if we're not vigilant, they'll take it back one seat at a time. That vigilance became generational. Children who had grown up watching the scandal unfold were now applying to law school. Airline executives were being required to attend equity training before signing a single policy. Venture capitalists began tying funding agreements to social responsibility benchmarks. The ripple of one racist act had become a tidal wave of accountability. 2 years later, Dr. Monroe boarded a plane again. The gate agent recognized her. So did the pilot. But this time, there were no hushed tones, no glances, no silent judgment, just dignity. She sat in the same seat, 1A, the seat she had once been told didn't belong to her. But this time, no one questioned it. Because she had earned it? No, because she never should have had to earn it in the first place. As the plane began to taxi, an elderly black woman across the aisle gently reached over and touched her arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't just fly. You carried all of us with you." And in that moment, Dr. Monroe smiled, not because the fight was over, but because it had just begun in places it never reached before. Because in a world obsessed with class, appearance, and access, she reminded everyone that basic human respect wasn't optional. It was essential. Final words, a nation called to conscience. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a defining moment. It asked every company, who do you protect? It asked every employee, what do you enable? It asked every bystander, what do you permit with your silence? And it asked every viewer, if it were you, would you stand up or sit down? That's what makes this story bigger than travel, bigger than corporate policy, bigger than lawsuits. It's about the value we assign to each other. And whether that value is conditional or inherent, Dr. Monroe didn't just force an apology, she forced a reckoning. And in doing so, she left a message that will echo every time someone checks in, buckles up, and dares to believe they deserve the same respect as anyone else. And now the question isn't what happened to her. It's what happens next because of her. Like my video and subscribe to my channel for more daily videos.